All right, now we're going.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for tuning in this evening. I am Gerard Floriano, Artistic Director of Finger Lakes Opera, with my fourth and final for this season episode of Behind the Curtain. I'm so excited for you, our viewers and our audience at Finger Lakes Opera, to get to meet this evening the wonderful stage director for the production that we're going to be doing this summer of The Barber of Seville, Stephanie Havey. Stephanie, it's great. Welcome. Great to see you. Welcome to Finger Lakes Opera.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here this evening.
So happy to have you. And I want to just, put it out there that Stephanie and I have been working on this production for over a year now, because Stephanie was scheduled to work with us last summer in 2020, but obviously the pandemic interceded. But we're so pleased, Stephanie, that you'll be able to work with us this summer. I'm excited to get to meet you eventually soon in person rather than over Zoom or the phone, which is the only way we've been able to connect for the last several months, 15 or 16 or 17 months. A little bit about Stephanie. She is the winner of the Adelaide Bishop Award. She's a really up-and-coming, wonderful opera stage director. She has won the American Opera America Director Designer Showcase. She's staged productions for Seattle Opera, Opera de Montreal, Pittsburgh Opera, the Philadelphia Orchestra, Hawaii Opera, and just to name a few. She's sought after as a collaborator for the development of new opera. She staged new works with Opera Philadelphia for their double exposure event, Opera America's New Works Forum, and is in her fourth season developing new works as a resident stage director for North American New Opera Workshop. We're so pleased to have her with us. And one of the bonuses that Stephanie's going to be able to give to us this summer is she's also, in addition to directing The Barber of Seville, our main stage production, she's going to be also directing our Summer Scenes program, which happens July 21st at Lincoln Hill Farms. So we're super excited, Stephanie, that you could be joining us for that. So I've talked quite a bit so far. Tell us, Stephanie, a little bit about your background and how you became an opera stage director. How did you get into this?
Sure. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was so fortunate that the opera in Knoxville had a program to bring in public school children to the opera to see dress rehearsals for free. And I know a lot of regional companies do this, and I love to share this experience because it was so important to me and really changed my life. But when I was 12, I got to go to a free dress rehearsal of the Magic Flute, and just so happened I was in the front row of this main stage performance, and I was just blown away. I loved opera instantly. And I have to say, all of my 12-year-old friends in the front row were also taken by the production. So, sometimes I think folks think middle school students might not be into opera and grand opera, but I would argue and say that usually middle school and high school students just love it. So that's where I was introduced to opera. It was on this field trip. I fell in love with it. Now directing came a few years later. Again, another fantastic public school teacher who took initiative and sort of became a mentor to me. I was auditioning for the musicals. I was in some of the musicals. I was dancing and acting and kind of pursuing those things. And she pulled me aside and said, I think you might have the right sort of temperament to try out stage directing. I didn't know anything about it. But she mentored me through staging my first play. And then I was just hooked. I absolutely loved it.
And when was this? This was in high school?
I was 18. I was in high school.
That's great.
Yeah. So that's how I first came to directing. And then I went to school. I studied opera. I was a voice major in undergrad. But I found an opera directing program for grad school. And at the time, I think it was the only one in the country. Now there's a few more. And I just slowly kind of, learned about the craft, and every director has to create their own path in this industry. There's really no one way a person becomes a stage director, but I sort of came at it from the perspective of studying music and singing. And I had been a performer, as a young person. So that's how I got into directing.
Wow. That's a great story. And you got into it relatively so young. And you're still young, but at the age of 18, I would think is is kind of before a lot of directors get their feet wet. And to get into that. I want to say, by the way, I forgot to say this at the top of the broadcast. We are taking questions from our viewers and listeners. So if you have a question, just text it to us on our YouTube page or send it to Finger Lakes Opera. We will get it on the air, and we're so pleased that you're listening live on YouTube on our podcast this evening. So Stephanie, as I said earlier, we have been in contact for over a year now, and you have been slated to work with us last year in 2020. What have you been doing in the interim? The pandemic has hit, and what have you been doing, and where are you now? I know you're already back at it, so tell our audience.
That's right. Well, so now I live in Florida. My husband and I live in Sarasota, Florida. And so actually, we travel most of the year. He's a performer. Spoiler alert, he's in the show.
Right, of course, he's our Bartolo.
He's our Bartolo. So we are on the road most of the year. And that's what we've done for the past 10 years, 15 years. So we were actually somewhat happy to have a chance to be at home in Florida this year. And we really enjoyed just being in the sun and trying to get outside more and do more outdoor activities. I'm sure a lot of folks tried to do that sort of thing. And I also decided to take business classes. So I sort of became a college student again and thought I would learn some new skills. And it was very interesting and challenging, but it in many ways affirmed my love for opera. So I'm so glad to be back working with you and doing what I love.
And so where are you now?
So actually I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I'm directing a production of La Boheme for Charlottesville Opera. And similarly, they've had to pivot to an outdoor production with no intermission. So we've reduced Boheme to 90 minutes, which actually we did not have to cut too much of Boheme to get it to 90 minutes. Okay. Yeah.
So you're doing that with one intermission or just none? No intermission.
No intermission. We're just plowing right through. So we did have to make some cuts, and we've had to sort of create a concept around, the shorter version. But we've just started rehearsals this week, and we open at the end of the month.
That's great. That's wonderful. So I know you're way into the history of Barber of Seville, and particularly the things related to the Beaumarchais play and the relation of that. Tell our audience, share with our audience any kind of insights and interesting tidbits that you have about the Beaumarchais play and how the Barber of Seville fits in that, and because some of our audience won't know necessarily where this comes from.
Sure. So the opera, The Barber of Seville, comes from a play written by Beaumarchais. And it was actually a trilogy of plays, the first being The Marriage of Figaro, which later became a very famous opera, and then The Barber of Seville, and then the third play was The Guilty Mother, which has become an opera, but it's not performed quite so often. So the operas, these stories originated with these French plays. And Beaumarchais is a fascinating figure. His life was just wild. So he lived in the 18th century, and he played a significant role in both the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And I couldn't possibly tell you all of the things that Beaumarchais did in his life. It's absolutely wild. But he was a spy, a French spy. He was a journalist who tried to take on corruption in Paris through his journalism. He was a patron who financed a complete edition of Voltaire's works, which was somewhat controversial. He also sponsored a monument to Liberty, where the Eiffel Tower now stands. Right. And he also was a watchmaker, and he made a teeny tiny watch that fit inside a ring. So I think that fits in with his spy.
Right, exactly, yeah. Exactly, his spy background is.
Yeah, so he's this fascinating guy, but he had a lot to say. And these plays, The Barber of Seville, Marriage of Figaro, they were extremely controversial and initially banned and all that sort of stuff because they were really mocking the aristocracy. They had something to say about the leaders and the government. And what was so controversial about them in general is that he showed the servants not only on equal Oh, sorry, my computer had a comment to make. I don't know if you could hear that. Um, he showed the servants not only on equal footing with their masters, but actually more intelligent than the masters. And this was much more pronounced in the plays than it is in the operas. The operas are a little bit toned down and tied in a bow, so that they're lighthearted comedies. But in the plays, there's actually a line where Figaro says to the Count, you know, you basically, the privileged few feel so proud of all of their accomplishments, but he says, in order for me to survive as a servant, I've had to use a lot more skill and intelligence, you know, to get where I am than to be born into status. So that's where these plays became somewhat controversial, but actually audiences loved them.
Absolutely, yes. They ate them up, especially in Europe at the time. And another interesting thing about these two plays, or I should say two acts of the Beaumarchais play, which were turned into the famous operas. The Marriage of Figaro happens after our opera, right? The actual action of the Marriage of Figaro happens after the Barber of Seville, and yet it was composed by Mozart some 2 or 3 decades prior to Rossini's working of that. And there was also another, I believe there was another popular version of the Barber of Seville during Rossini's days by Paisiello, a composer named Paisiello, which was kind of in competition with Rossini's, but it's fallen, of course, by the wayside over time. So very fascinating stuff, and just really interesting to get into. And Beaumarchais himself, as you said, just an interesting character.
Oh yeah, and I should mention that when you see the production of Marriage of Figaro or Barber of Seville, this becomes very clear. But the character of Figaro is meant to be sort of the mouthpiece of Beaumarchais. I mean, this is the character that represents him. And I told you all of these different things that Beaumarchais did in his lifetime. He was really a jack of all trades, and that's the character of Figaro, who is sort of has his hand in everything, and also knows how to seek out help when he needs it. He knows where to go and just how to ask. And that was a characteristic that Beaumarchais had as well.
That's great. That is great. Hey, listen, we have a question from Jay from Brighton, wants to know how your concept changed from 2020. This is a great question. How your concept changed from 2020 when it was indoors to this summer now that it is outside. Really fascinating question.
So should we talk about how the entire concept of producing opera changed for us to lead into?
How about let's stick with your concept of Barber right now, because I know that when you and I were talking in March of 2020, it was a conversation that we were having in March, February of 2021.
Yeah.
So how did those conversations go?
Yeah, so I love to do traditional productions of Barber of Seville. The characters in the story are based on a tradition called Commedia dell'arte. And this is an Italian tradition of theater that involved theatrical troupes that performed together all the time. And they played stock characters. Mm-hmm. In a way, it's kind of like if you watch a sitcom on television today, and the same sitcom could be on TV for like 10 years, and it's these same characters, but every week that you watch, they're in a different situation, but it's always the same people. So that's sort of what Commedia was like. There was a set of so many characters, and every play they'd be in a different situation. Now, the one difference is that they would be improvising what happened. So there'd sort of be like, it's like Whose Line Is It Anyway? in a way, you know, they're given like a rough plot and then they improvise around that. And Commedia is a fascinating art form. It's still practiced today, but it's very traditional. And so all these characters in the Barber of Seville, yes, they're these characters from the Beaumarchais play, but they're still based on certain stock characters. You have the young lovers. Rosina and the Count represent the young lovers. You have Arlecchino. There's many different names for him, but this same character, Figaro, represents like an Arlecchino. and he's a jack of all trades. He's very flexible and bendable, and he pops up in unexpected places. And then you have Bartolo, who in the story is like the father figure, the doctor, the know-it-all. He's grumpy, a comedic character. And so all of these characters are stock characters. And so I wanted to go back to that Commedia tradition and examine the stock characters that they're based on. And these stock characters also later in history become what we think of as clowns. You know, you have the sad clown. This is a character that comes from Commedia. And so we were thinking about doing a traditional production, but really rooted in the Commedia characters. And so I think in rethinking the production and the concept, we thought about how to still base it in Commedia, but make something a little bit more interactive for the audience. We want this production to be a celebration of returning to live performance.
Exactly, yeah.
So we thought about how to create something that our audience would really identify with, feel like part of the action and part of the story, and still basing it in Commedia.
Right, and so we're going to, for those in our audience that don't know, we're going to be outside, outdoors this summer at the Center Stage Amphitheater in Parenton for these productions. So that takes on, you know, a whole new kind of world, right? As singers and our characters in our opera will, as you say, interact with audience members in surprising and wonderful ways. This is all I'll say. I know you have some great tricks up your sleeve.
Well, you know, in the beginning of, okay, when we started saying we need to be outside and we need to possibly observe all of the safety protocols, you know, for a while there, I was thinking, how do we stage this socially distanced? What if we need to wear masks and that sort of thing? But fortunately, we're getting to that point where we're thinking we'd be safe to perform without the masks and do more traditional style of staging. So we're really starting to have fun with the ideas of what we are free to do outside.
Right. So along those lines, I have another question from a listener who asks, any secrets that you can tell us about Flow's 2021 Barber that audiences will see in August? Another good question.
Yes. Well, so we want to take advantage of this outdoor space. Usually in opera, you know, we're sort of like within our box, our little proscenium stage, we have to keep it in the box. So we're going to go outside of the box for this production. And we want to create really a playground for the cast and for the audience. And we want it to feel like a street festival that you are attending and have this feeling of improvisation and surprise. And so I will say we're going to do some things outside that we couldn't do inside.
Exactly. And that's, you know, that's kind of why I think one of the lessons of the pandemic, right, is we have to pivot. So how can we do this and do it maybe differently, but maybe even sometimes a little bit better. So I think that could be, you know, kind of a buzzword for the production. Another question, this one for Stephanie and Jerry. So what are some of the adjustments that you've had to make because of COVID? And Stephanie, I'll let you go first.
Well, performing outside would be the biggest change we've had to make. And it's a very rare occasion that we would perform opera outside a full production, you know, with orchestra. And so we've had to think about how to build a theatrical space that accommodates the storytelling. Mm-hmm. And where I found kind of my first solution to that was going back to that Commedia tradition. And Commedia dell'arte was performed outside. I mean, these troupes performed in the streets. They had sort of a stage that they just had a stage and maybe some curtains that they strung up, and that was it. And everything else was just improvised around that. So we took our inspiration from that style of a stage and we said, you know, what do we absolutely need to tell this story? And then what are some other surprises we can throw in? So we are going to build a structure that would be similar to that Commedia style. And we look to what else might you find outdoors? What other elements would you find outdoors that we could bring together and kind of create a clown show out of unexpected outdoor elements?
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. And from the musical side, I can tell our listener that we made a few adjustments. One of the ones, and you, Stephanie, you had alluded to it earlier in your comments about the Bohème that you're directing now. We judiciously cut Barber down to be a one act, a pretty hefty one act, and we got all the action and all the important music in, but really trimmed it down because of the fact that we're outside and the outdoor seating, et cetera, et cetera. Another one that we've had to adjust for, at least for Finger Lakes Opera audiences, our orchestra is a bit smaller than we are used to, because when we were planning this, and even still today now, who knows, how close we can get, and there's only so much room on the stage. The cast is probably a little bit smaller than we might have indoors, would you say?
Mhm.
So these are COVID adjustments that we've had to make, but like I said, I think their audience will really appreciate the overall production and the just the comedic energy in this production. The singers are absolutely wonderful.
One of the sort of changes to our setup is that the orchestra is going to be behind the singers, and so that's a little bit of a challenge. But to look at it in a positive light, that means that the action of the show is going to be right there close to the audience. And I have to say, when thinking about this type of interactive experience, I was reminded of one of my favorite, well, two of my favorite theatrical experiences. One of them was the first time I saw a Cirque du Soleil production, just being awed by the incredible use of the space. If you've ever seen a Cirque show live, there's performing happening all around you in unexpected ways. I mean, the production that I saw, performers were climbing the walls, literally, flying overhead. And then also there was some performers who appeared to be ushers seating us in the theater. And then this whole show happened as a pre-show before the show started. So I thought about that experience and how I felt when I saw it and how I felt when I left the theater. And I thought that's how we want to make people feel. And we have the opportunity now in this type of outdoor performance venue.
Right, to really have a lot of fun with it. So I have another question from a listener. Olivia from Rochester is asking, how many productions, Stephanie, you have done in 2021 so far?
So the La Boheme I'm working on right now is my first production back since the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, it's been over a year, right? When the pandemic started, I was in Boston. I had staged a show. It was supposed to open on Friday the 13th.
Oh my.
And that morning I got the call that the show was canceled.
Right.
And so we all had to fly away. We all left Boston that day, and the production sat in the theater for about 8 or 9 months, just sat on the stage. So that was my last production. And then, I just started this week here on this La Boheme.
Yeah, it's been and I'm sure I know because from talking to you that your calendar picks up drastically after this, and you're going great guns, starting next with Finger Lakes Opera and then on and on and on. So another question from a listener was listening to our conversation earlier about the summer scenes and wanted you to comment a little bit about what will the summer scenes entail, those happening on July 21st at Lincoln Hill Farms featuring the Tomita Young Artists. What can you say about those?
Well, I can say that you might see a little bit more story inspired by Beaumarchais. There's going to be a little bit of Marriage of Figaro in there. We really wanted to throw in a little bit of Figaro to pair with our Barber of Seville. But we have a wide variety of scenes. I don't know if you want to share.
Yeah, we've got Elixir of Love. We've got a couple of, it's a really wonderful and I think varied program. Couple of scenes from the Elixir of Love, the great trio from Carmen, then from off the beaten path from Ana Bolena, Tutta in voi la luce mia, the Act One duet, is a wonderful piece. And you mentioned a couple of scenes from Marriage of Figaro, and then closing out that show with Make Our Garden Grow from Bernstein's Candide. So kind of a wide variety. And that I'm thrilled that you'll be working with our young artists on those scenes. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I am really looking forward to that. I love doing scene work because you can really dig into the detail of the text. And sometimes when you're staging a whole opera, you're thinking really big picture, but scene work is like where you get all the good acting, work done.
Yeah, you can really get in and work on the material in a detailed way that you can't necessarily when you're doing a whole production. Absolutely. So I want to announce to our listeners that we are going to we're doing a contest for some prize packs coming up, and so we will pull the names once the podcast is over. Apparently, we can't pull the names for the drawing while the podcast is going, but we're going to pull the names when the podcast is over. We will do a drawing at that time and contact the winner for the prize package. So listeners, thank you for listening, and we will do that after the podcast is over. I have one more question from a listener that asks, and this is something that always fascinates me. I'm a music director, so I work on kind of the other side of things, but I always have the best seat in the house for watching the process work. Talk about your process, Stephanie, for coming up with a concept for an opera that you are directing. When the whole thing is beginning, what kinds of work do you go through, study, and you alluded to a lot of it actually in the past, but what kinds of things do you research and do when you're trying to come up with that concept?
Sure. Well, there's a slightly different approach if I'm working on a piece that I know really well because it's part of the repertoire, like the Barber of Seville. This is an opera. I've seen many productions. I've directed it a few times. Or if I'm working on new opera, which is sort of like the in a way, the opposite end of things. I mean, of course, all opera was once new, but I will say in general, I start with the text and I just read through the libretto. And what I'm looking for are key relationships that stand out. Are there different classes amongst the characters? Is that an important element of the story? Or are there different relationships, or what's the conflict about? And I kind of look at, what's the main idea of the story? What are the biggest conflicts? And then oftentimes, especially in opera, the main issue of the story has to do with setting and place and class, politics, big ideas like this. And so I try to break down either the class difference issues or the politics of the piece into their most simplistic terms. So whether you say that's like upper class versus lower class or servants versus masters, is one of the main issues happening in Barber of Seville. Break something down to its simplest form. And then I think about, is there a way that I relate to this personally? Is there a personal experience I have that connects? Sometimes that's just for my own benefit in understanding the piece and relating to it. But other times I might use that to create a new concept for a piece. And I'll give you an example. This Bohème that I'm doing right now, I've directed a few Bohèmes. My last one was traditional, and I absolutely love doing a traditional Bohème. But I thought about how the pandemic might inform how we view Bohème now, how we listen to it, and how we hear that story. And, the characters in Bohème are revolutionaries, and they were very, very active they would have been very active as Bohemians in protest and in writing music and creating artwork that spoke out against injustice in the world, as sort of reflecting on the French Revolution. And so I thought, that's something that we could relate to as a society now. And I looked at history, and we're basing this Bohème on the riots in Paris in 1968, in May of 1968. And so how I got to that concept again was just paring the whole issue down to its most simplistic form and thinking it's a story about haves and have-nots and how Mimi doesn't have access to healthcare. So I looked into French history and saw when did they have universal health care, and it was after the 68 riots. And so that's where we ended up with our setting. So Barber of Seville is a different case. It's a comedy, of course, but it's a similar process. I think, how do I relate to this story? How could the audience relate to it? Do they have a personal experience that might tie into these dynamics? And then we develop it from there.
Right. So there's a lot of historical research, dramaturgy, just digging into it. Really, it's fascinating and a fun process, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I didn't mention the music, and the music is my passion, and that's why I do opera. I started out as an opera director, and that's the path that I'm on. So I certainly don't overlook that. With pieces like the Barber of Seville and Bohème, I already know the music, so it's in my ear as I'm reading the libretto each time. But I also, how I work is, after we're sort of staging these big ideas, I look in the score, and if there is a dynamic change, if there's a tempo change, any moment, any phrase that happens in the score, I think there needs to be a dramatic reason for that. I mean, the composer wrote it for a dramatic reason. So we have something on stage that shows the audience, what does that shift in the music mean? What does it represent?
You'll find it in the action.
Yeah. So, I mean, score analysis is huge for me, and I absolutely love listening to the orchestration. And we want to identify every new color and then put that on stage as well.
Wonderful. Absolutely. And I'm sure our audience is waiting with bated breath to see our productions this summer. Stephanie, I want to thank you for joining us. I think that's all the time we have for this evening, but I want to tell our audience, again, the drawings will be taking place after the podcast goes off the air, so you will be contacted if you are chosen for that prize pack. I also want to say, just give a plug for our season. Our season at Finger Lakes Opera is the Summer Scenes, July 21st at Lincoln Hill in Canandaigua. This is all on our website, so you don't have to write anything down. You won't be tested. Go to fingerlakesopera.org. Three Little Pigs, you had mentioned earlier, and I thought of this, that you saw an opera as a child, Magic Flute, which really was stuck with you, obviously, for your entire life. And here you are directing. So we're doing Three Little Pigs, July 27th at the Maxion stage in Canandaigua. Our opera hits, which also features our To Meet a Young Artist, will be July 31st at the Center Stage Amphitheater in Parenton. And of course, Barber of Seville, August 6th and 7th at Center Stage in the Center Stage Amphitheater, Parenton. Stephanie, thank you. I want to thank you for taking the time. I know you're in the midst of staging and very, very busy. Oh, wait a minute, we have one more question. Wait a minute, we have one more question. I'm going to get this in because it just came in, and I don't want anybody to be left out. Lee from Canandaigua wants to know, what was Stephanie's instrument? Was she a singer before becoming a director? I think we have time for that.
Singer, yes. And I still love to sing for fun. I think it's good for the soul.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we thank you immensely, and thank our audience for tuning in. I also want to thank Dave and Elizabeth, Dave Moffat and Elizabeth Long, who are working behind the scenes to make this YouTube magic happen. So for Finger Lakes Opera, I'm Gerard Floriano. Thank you for watching, and we will see you at the opera.